Reflections on energy management. When someone hurts us, it creates an emotional charge, a charge of fear, a charge of anger, sometimes hatred, sometimes hostility. But the general energy is to push back and push into either fight, flight, freeze, but respond to dissipate the situation that is hurting us. The pattern of energy that's coming towards us that's causing pain, sometimes just terror, but often pain, is attacked or defended against. And the value of that charge, this is an electrical charge. It's, you touch the skin, it creates a certain amount of energy, and that energy is available as a resource to create dynamic change. Now, when that energy goes out as a resource to create dynamic change, it is positive. When the anger is expressed and a new boundary is established, oh, sorry, I will pay more attention when I'm around you in the future. Good, because I don't want this boundary crossed. So there is a response. There is a reestablishment of a healthy boundary. This is very constructive. However, when boundary violation is initiated by an overwhelming force, a parent in relationship to a child, a culture in relationship to an individual, a corporate entity in relationship to an employee, when a boundary violation, a pain initiation is initiated by an overwhelming power, number one. Number two, when that power is sociopathic. You see, because an empathic power system understands that its role is to serve its most vulnerable constituents, its minorities, those in a vulnerable situation. So, for example, in an empathic situation with an insurance company, when you can't pay your insurance because your back has been broken and you can't move and you can't make an income, and the whole point of the insurance was to protect you in this kind of situation, an ethical insurance company will go out of its way to see that you're cared for in that situation. As an employee, when you've discovered a corporate problem, a violation, illegal activity, an area where several workers are not safe, and you bring it to management, and there's empathy, this is rewarded with appreciation. Thank you for bringing this to our attention, and we're going to protect you. But in a sociopathic dynamic, the child tells the parent, "Don't hit me like that." And the parent, in their own emotional relationship with out-of-control dominant forces, the parent who is terrified they're not going to be able to pay their rent with a sociopathic landlord and a sociopathic boss and a sociopathic government, is in a state of trauma. What's going to happen? I'll be ashamed. I'll be ashamed by my parents, sociopathic parents. I'll be shamed by my parents. I'll be shamed by my friends, sociopathic friends, quote unquote. And my government is not going to help me, and my boss is not going to help me, and my landlord could care less about my situation. I'm in an overwhelmingly sociopathic environment with an overwhelming force, and I don't know how I'm going to deal with this. And while I'm wrestling with this issue, this child is bringing up stuff that I also don't know how to deal with. And I tell the child to shut up. And The child, of course, has no clue about all these sociopathic elements. The child is born assuming that we're in a sane and empathic world. The parent lets loose on the child. The child says, stop. Nobody's listening to the parent who's saying, stop, please stop giving me these tyrannical assignments. Stop policing me and pushing me and pushing me. Stop with these constant rent reminders. Stop. And nobody's stopping. And so there's a rage that goes towards the child in the parent whose screams for help are not being answered. And the idea that this child somehow gets to have a break. When there is no break for the parent, it can produce envy, it can produce bitterness, it can produce rage, it can produce the sense of helplessness. I wish I could stop, I don't know where to turn. And the anger at helplessness being induced when helplessness is the overwhelming condition and it's threatening to paralyze. This often unleashes a tirade of rage against the child. The audacity of expecting sanity and empathy in a sociopathic culture. Now keep in mind, this is just our and other sociopathic cultures. There are empathic cultures that do not have violence. They don't need to. But what we're looking at is when force of an overwhelming nature is sociopathic and comes down in attack against healthy boundaries, there is a sense of a splitting between the part in the self that wants to protect the self and the part of the self that wants to protect the self by avoiding the backlash that comes in a sociopathic and overwhelmingly powerful environment for protecting the self. So you've got the inner defender splits into one part that says, this isn't right, stop it, and another part that says, don't talk, don't say anything or it'll be worse. Now the protector is bound up to cope with overwhelming sociopathic force. Now, as this becomes a pattern, energy doesn't get to flow and discharge, and the individual gets sick, which then affirms the deterioration in the larger culture. The larger culture now also gets sick because it's learning overwhelming sociopathic force is learning that that is a coping strategy. It can't solve the overwhelming sociopathic force coming towards it, but it can pass it on to those more vulnerable and find some relief. So the coping structure goes downhill, and with it the deterioration of a culture. Now, in the dynamic of forgiveness, which is a decharging of certain terrains, the first thing to understand is that in order to forgive, to discharge something, you've got to have access to it. And what often happens in these traumatic moments, a trauma is a moment when overwhelming power expresses a sociopathic trait by punishing the healthy efforts to assert and defend the self. This is a traumatic situation, and it leads to dissociation, where the victim of overwhelming sociopathic force will dissociate with the part that is not and cannot be responded to in the given sociopathic environment. And in that case, the person no longer has access to the charge. It's like a fuse has been blown. It's dissociated from the emotional center, from the biological center. Now you cannot forgive, you cannot discharge something because it's been disconnected from the system. It first has to be brought back. Now, the most devastating thing for the body, the heart, and the mind is to be divided and then pitted against one another. Divided and pitted against one another. Or really pitted against the self, where this part of the self tries to cope by shutting up and this part of the self tries to cope by speaking out. And this part of the self tries to cope by pushing people away, and this part of the self tries to cope by securing help. And they're in this constant tug of war with one another in response to a divisive and a disintegrating environment. This is where you have, it's kind of like in a four-wheel drive car. They're both burning rubber, but they're spinning in opposite directions. One's saying something that's very true. This is not right, I need to speak up. The other's saying something that's very true. When I speak up, I get beaten. This part is saying, I really don't like this kind of partner. This partner always brings this side out in me. And this other part is saying, if I don't have a partner and this is the familiar partner, then I'm going to die. I'm going to be all alone. And they're spinning in different directions. And what needs to happen to resolve the exhaustion of this endless grinding in different directions, this endless division of the self, is with support, we need to integrate, meaning pull certain pockets of the emotional charge back in the system, differentiate in time and space, which is, of course, much more difficult later on, because now you've got the present-day reality where that issue isn't happening. But the tension and the charge is often in the past where it's still happening. You've got to bring those parts back into the body and release them and say, I'm no longer in a situation where I will be beat over the head with a 2x4 if I speak the truth. And now this voice that's saying, don't speak the truth or I'll die, which is frozen in place because it's been dissociated. Now it's causing problems. I need to release that. And it's not condoning the behavior, it's releasing the energy. It's very much like an electrical magnet where, or even a battery where you start pushing voltage towards each other, it creates heat. And yet it's if you've got 9 volts pushing you this way and 24 volts pushing you that way, you've got slight movement this way, but you've got a lot of heat generated in the electricity that's going against itself. And our biology is an electrical circuit. So in order to forgive, you've got to reassociate the issue. In order to reassociate a traumatic issue, we need help. Because trauma is one of those things that floods the ego and is thus bigger than the ego. In order to have that help, we need competent support. That's very lacking in a sociopathic and trauma-illiterate culture. So you have this crisis here. And when we do receive that support and release the charge, what we're looking at is to clear the system of emotional and electrical charges from the past to come into the present environment and orient our pattern of behavior towards Maslow's hierarchy of needs: survival, security, love and belonging, self-esteem, and moving towards integration of our strengths, self-actualization, bringing in who we are as a consciousness, and then gifting that magnificence to the world. It comes at level 5, 6, and 7, that giving back, that sense of ultimate transcendence. And so we have, again, this very interesting dynamic where it is the sociopathic elements in the environment that stop the individual climbing to the point in the hierarchy of needs where one can freely and generously give back to those who are in a sociopathic state who ultimately need help as much as the people they violate in those moments of imbalanced power, when people are just climbing, when people need power structures to survive, to feel secure, to meet love and belonging. When they need them, that's exactly when they can be manipulated and silenced by sociopathic power structures that are not having their own needs. They're in this pecking order of violation. So a few reflections that help me integrate and get clear on how to work with these things.